Thank you all for joining us tonight for what promises to be a timely and deeply relevant conversation. My name is Vincent Glaser. I'm a member of Parliament for Die Linke and a full member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I'm very pleased to guide us through tonight's conversation. We are living through a period of profound global transformation, marked by shifting power dynamics, deepening inequality, and renewed struggles over justice, sovereignty, and solidarity. In this context, we ask, what kinds of political and social alternatives are emerging? And how can we think and act beyond the old frameworks of domination, dependency, and unipolarity? To help us explore these questions, I'm honored to welcome three outstanding speakers. Wichai.
Mario looked at me puzzled.
Wichai, a historian, author, and director of the Tricontinental Institute, brings a powerful perspective from the global South and a long-standing commitment to the internationalism and decolonized development. Radhika Desai, professor of political economy, is one of the leading thinkers on global power shifts and multipolarity, offering a Marxist lens on today's transformations. And Mario Neumann from Medico International grounds these global questions in real struggles, in global health, in solidarity work, and in the fight against structural inequality. So, to begin our conversation, the idea of multipolarity is central to the work of all of you sitting here, but it means very different things depending on where you stand politically, geographically, or historically. So, Wichai, if I may start with you. Multipolarity is often framed as an antidote to Western hegemony. What is necessary to guarantee a just and truly multipolar world? How can we move beyond a mere shift of elite power centers?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Firstly, I'm really happy to be here. This is the home of Rosa-Luxemburg, one of my heroes. My second child of all my daughters is named Rosa, after Rosa-Luxemburg. Because who doesn't love Rosa-Luxemburg? You know, what a life, what a life. A life well led, actually. That's the interesting thing. A life well led. And if you haven't read her letters, I highly recommend them. Because in her letters, you really get the sense of a person who was not only thinking about Marxism all the time or how to make a revolution, but was interested in nature, in flowers, wrote very tenderly to her friends and cherished friendship. And that, for me, is a very important norm of the left, to cherish friendship, and build real living relations with people in the now, not just abstractly, socialism. I really recommend you read her letters. Vincenz has asked an impossible question because history is a very cruel process. Imagine that I live in Santiago de Chile, and 500 plus years ago, the so-called conquistadors crossed the Atlantic. They wipe out native populations. They set up various forms of state structure. They leave behind a legacy that doesn't really produce elites that are, given over to democracy. In fact, when the people, the working people, try to establish their own kind of governance structures, such as in 1970, when the people of Chile, a very small minority really, voted for Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity government, right from the day that they started building the process of establishing some kind of decency, okay? The word socialism is interesting because I always think, there's a lot of synonyms for socialism. One of them is just to establish decency, just to allow people to transcend basic problems of hunger and, having no medical care and illiteracy and so on. Just as they tried to do that, Vincent, the United States intervenes, not with the coup, but with suffocation. Almost 3 years of suffocation. They prevented the government from getting access to dollars. They squeezed the Chilean government, and as Richard Nixon told Henry Kissinger, made the economy scream. And then eventually they gave the green light to Augusto Pinochet, a general, to send the tanks out and the airplanes and smash the Chilean government, elected government, legally elected government. Then they just killed the left, including the great Victor Jara, who was killed in the National Stadium. History is cruel. When ordinary people try to establish a process of decency, they get smashed because old hierarchies assert themselves. The Iranians, they're building their own process. They have their own history, their own culture, their own problems, okay? They don't need to inherit problems from other countries. They have millennia of their own problems. They didn't threaten anybody. They didn't attack anybody. It's an illegal attack on Iran by Israel recently, yeah? Why? Because they are building their own process. They want their own sovereignty. They are trading with China. They are building something with the Russians, whatever they are doing. Then the United States attacks them. Right now, Iran has retaliated and attacked the Al Ubaid base in Qatar. It's probably a choreographed attack. Hopefully it will de-escalate, yeah? Hopefully. Interesting how so many governments are silent about this unprovoked attack on Iran. When the Russians violated the UN Charter and entered Ukraine, there was universal condemnation. Ursula von der Leyen almost had a heart attack. She condemned it so many times, I was surprised she found new language for the condemnation. But on this attack on Iran, there is almost unanimous opinion that it's fine. It's a violation of the UN Charter. Article 2.4 has been violated. Nobody said anything. So when one asks, I hope the new order doesn't repeat the old. It's a premature question. Because first, let's try to establish a new order. Anytime people try to establish something new, they get smashed. We are so far from dethroning the new order that to start speculating, will the next order be more just, is premature. And sometimes, and this is the tough part of this, Vincent, sometimes the nature of the attack on the new order starts to structure the new order. So if there's immense military violence against the emergence of the new order that is emerging, I'm sorry, the term new order sounds terrible. I don't mean to use such a terrible sounding term. The emergence of a new world that is being produced, if the military attack against it is ferocious, it's going to strengthen the military in this new world. Because these countries will have to defend themselves. So right now, for instance, this attack on Iran is sending a message to all countries in the global south to actually have a nuclear weapon. This is not a war against Iran that's going to prevent nuclear proliferation. It's going to actually accelerate it. If I was the head of a government, I would seek a nuclear bomb today. Because I don't want the United States to randomly attack me like this. I would follow the example of countries that have a nuclear shield. So I don't want that for the new world. I don't want a new world where we all have nuclear bombs, for God's sake. So the character of the new world that appears, Vincent, is going to be determined by the character of the behavior of the old elites in preventing the new world from being born. And that, I think, is determinate and important for people in Europe to participate in. That actually Europeans have the possibility. And I know this is a stereotype about Europeans, that Europeans are the sophisticated ones who can temper the mad dog Americans. Yeah? It's an old stereotype. But in fact, that stereotype hasn't even appeared in the world recently, because your leaders are so absolutely sheepish in the presence of, I mean, Mark Rutte, who, you know, is just a third-rate politician from Netherlands, made the General Secretary or Director General or Secretary General of NATO, goes to the White House, sits with Trump, sorry, Radhika, sits with Trump and says to Trump, I don't know if you watched the video, says to Trump, please come to The Hague, it's my hometown, we really want to host you. We are going to make the NATO summit a great display of American power. I mean, that's a European politician. I don't even know if you got the problem with that sentence. We are going to make the NATO summit a great display of American power. I mean, Mark Rutte, have some self-respect. NATO is supposed to be an alliance of all these countries, not a place for the display of American power. But if Europe is so sheepish in the face of American power, well, then the rest of us are going to have to deal with making the world on our own. We will have no allies in Europe, you know, unless you get your act together. We definitely have almost no allies in many of the international organizations. Where is the UN today? You know, where is the security? Where is the Secretary General? Where is the International Atomic Energy Agency? The United States bombed directly a nuclear facility. The IAEA should have released a statement immediately condemning it, saying that this is extremely dangerous, not for what would have happened in those 3 energy facilities, but what happens if India just goes and bombs Pakistan's nuclear reactor? I mean, I know that Israel has a history of doing this. They bombed Osirak in 1981 in Iraq. It's not the first time. But this is ridiculous. The IAEA is silent on this precedent. So when you say, well, I hope the new world will be better than the old, I'm trying to emphasize the character of the new world will be shaped by how the powerful countries of the old fight against its birth.
Thank you, Vijay, for your impressing answer on my maybe a bit difficult question, and I think all of you can already feel it. We are in the middle of the topic already. Radhika, I have a question for you as well, but you for sure can also rely on what Vijay said. From a Marxist perspective, are the shifts in power distribution which we are witnessing at the moment challenging the global capitalist order, or is it just a rearrangement within the capitalist system?
Thank you, and I promise not to harangue you as Vijay just did. So, okay, those are both very interesting questions, and I'll take them in turn. In fact, in my mind, they are very closely related. So, first of all, you asked about, how is multipolarity an antidote to Western hegemony? I can think of, at least several ways in which it is an antidote to hegemony. So, the first thing I'd like to say is that if you want to, the word multipolarity began to become very current in the early 2010s, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which, by the way, I call the North Atlantic financial crisis. A lot of people call it the global financial crisis, but there was nothing global about it. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis. Apart from the US financial institutions themselves, the countries whose financial institutions had gorged themselves on the toxic securities produced by the American financial system were the UK and continental European countries, and they were the ones who were worst affected. But anyway, by the by, so in the early 2010s, we start talking about multipolarity, and at that point, you begin to see two very distinct things going on. So on the one hand, what has become clear is that productive power is spreading around the world. And we're now talking about a point in time that is a dozen years ago. So things looked a little bit different, and people talked about not just China, but also several other countries that were performing very well. You know, India was in a good growth pattern under a much better government than we have right now. Brazil, Russia, etc., they were also riding a wave of the commodity boom and so on still at that time. So it looked as though there was this bunch of countries that were doing very well. So productive power was spreading around the world. And it was particularly, the countries which were growing better were precisely those countries that had either never become neoliberal, like China, or having suffered badly under neoliberalism, like Russia, or most Latin American countries, like Brazil, were sort of reacting to it to some extent, or as in the case of India, had always applied it in a sort of modified sort of fashion. So in a certain sense, that was that, whereas the Western countries, they were really, to the extent that they had applied neoliberalism to themselves. And of course, the United States and the UK were in the forefront of this, and they were suffering the most. They were suffering accelerated deindustrialization, loss of economic power, etc. So both of these things, to me, constitute, or they together create a multipolarity. So, and you see, the other thing about this is that, for a long time, I remember I was a graduate student in the 1980s, and in the 1980s and 1990s, everybody expected that the whole world was going to become capitalist, and, so on, and somehow this was an inevitable thing, and that was the gist of the idea of globalization. People said the tide of globalization will lift all boats, and so on and so forth. But in the 21st century, particularly very recently, a very new reality has come before us. If we think about it, if imagine in your mind a map of all those countries that has imposed sanctions on Russia. That includes, of course, the NATO countries and so on, the North Atlantic countries, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, US allies, and so on. So if you think about, and of course Eastern Europe, so there's a little, and compare that to a map of the imperialist countries in 1914. And if you think about the countries sanctioning Russia today as essentially being a proxy for the imperialist countries today, the imperialist world has not expanded, or at least the world of developed capitalism has not expanded very much at all. And the divides between the world of capitalism and the rest of the world have deepened. And so that is another way in which multipolarity, because at the end of the day, while the rest of the world, China, of course, has developed spectacularly and has continued to do so even after, the early 2010s. But today, even if you are not a particularly rich country, for example, the United States, in its history, it may overrun Grenada or Panama, but it has to think twice before actually invading. I'm not talking about bombing, but invading another country. It is not so easy to do that. So I think that there is a sense in which the effective sovereignty of the third world has increased. So that is also another element, and that is definitely a check on Western hegemony. Thirdly, at the core of multipolarity is the assertion of economic sovereignty, just as at the core of imperialism is the denial of economic sovereignty. Because what does imperialism say? Imperialism says that all countries must open up their economies so that Western corporations can come and go as they please, do as they please, buy what they please, invest as they please, etc., have whatever labor relations as they, conduct their labor relations as they please, etc. And this is the essence, the denial of economic sovereignty. And economic sovereignty is, so to me, it lies at the heart of this. And this goes along. So in that sense, it is also an antidote to Western hegemony. Fourthly, it also embodies a very, very different vision of the world order, in the sense that the world order envisaged by imperialism, going back to the earliest days of imperialism, has always been about opening up the rest of the world to Western power, Western private corporations, and so on. Whereas precisely the developing countries today, and of course the socialist countries, so I count both of them as part of the trend towards multipolarity, have all insisted on the right to have very different types of economies. We don't have to have a neoliberal economy. We can have as much state ownership as we want. We can have capital controls if we want. We can manage our trade. We must manage our trade. We must protect our agriculture. We must protect our pharmacological industries, whatever it may be. That's what it's always been about. And so their vision of the world order is very different from the Western vision, which is, you know, as I say, of imposing economic openness on the world, which has been justified in a number of different ways, but more recently it has been justified under the names of the rules-based international order, which, as some people joke, we make the rules and you obey them. That's what the West essentially says to people. And it's not really rules-based at all, because under the rubric of the rules-based international order, the West has essentially made up the rules as it's gone along. So, and this different vision of the world order is actually embodied already in the Charter of the United Nations, which is why, you know, in the earlier discussion in one of the workshops, I pointed out that in many ways NATO as an imperialist alliance was created precisely in opposition to the United Nations, because the United Nations recognizes the right to every country to have their own economies. It does not impose neoliberal rules on everybody. That was done by the World Bank and the IMF, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. So in that sense, also the spread of multipolarity represents a challenge, and it's not a surprise that it's only in recent years that you've had a grouping of countries rather, like Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and many other such countries that have created a group of called the Friends of the United Nations Charter. So this is another very important development. So essentially, multipolarity is driven forward by two types of countries. Firstly, driven forward today by the communist countries and by third world nationalist regimes. So from a Marxist perspective, which is your specific question for me, in what way is it challenging the global capitalist order? So to me, you know, there are two distinct phases of the advance of multipolarity. So I have, in my view, the first phase occurred when Germany, your country, the United States, Japan, etc., industrialized beginning in the late 19th and going on into the early 20th century. People forget how traumatic this was for the then dominant country in the world, namely Britain, because Britain lost its hold over the world market. Britain experienced competition in the world market, and of course from that point on, Britain began a long process of deindustrialization, which has never been corrected. It is still ongoing. So it lost markets, it lost industry, all of these sorts of things. But in this first phase, for a number of reasons, the development of these countries, which was also, you know, essentially economic nationalists. You had Friedrich List, the Americans had intellectuals like Henry Carey and so on. The Japanese had their own theorizers of these things. So they were essentially forms of economic nationalism, because once you have one country that dominates the world market, other countries cannot industrialize without protecting their economy to a substantial extent and without the state intervening to develop your economy. So this is the first phase, but it was still capitalist because because, you know, for a number of reasons, including the fact that the technological gap between the developing countries of the time, namely Germany or the US, and Britain, the developed country of the time, was not great, etc., etc. But most importantly, because these newly developing countries of the time could still be imperialist. After 1914, the countries that wished to industrialize no longer had that possibility. So what you have seen since then, and that's why you have seen a very different type of development, a much harder type of development, because like I said earlier, it had to take place, you know, it was now taking place in countries that had already been set back by imperialism. It had to take place without the luxury of imperialism, without being able to exploit other countries in your own industrialization. And thirdly, it has to take place against imperialist resistance, which we are still witnessing. This is what the reason why the United States cannot stand the existence of a Russia or a China or an Iran or a Venezuela is because these countries still insist on their economic sovereignty, which the United States wishes to deny them. So from a...
Radhika, sorry, don't want to interrupt you, but I also want to give Mario the chance to,
yes.
to talk a bit.
Last sentence then, sorry about that. Last sentence then, the last thing I want to say is that, therefore, from a Marxist perspective, I think it's important for us to remember that Marx considered capitalism to be exploiting both nations and classes. And it will be an alliance of nations and classes that will stand up to capitalism and the imperialism that necessarily goes along with it. Sorry about taking that long. But here.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for your very interesting and I guess kind of unique view on history and politics. Mario, from your practical work in global health, have you seen concrete shifts in access to resources and the right to health based on multipolar power shifts? And from your insights into work on the ground, would you say that global inequalities are actually being challenged?
Yeah, even if we now have some minutes on the clock, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, indeed, what I will answer now is coming from a maybe slightly different perspective than what we heard before. So we have to figure out later then how we can combine, or maybe where we have a conflict. Anyway, to say some words about Medico International, because I think I don't want to advertise my organization, I hate that, but I think it's a bit important to understand what I'm talking about. So Medico is a very, I would say in the leftist arena, well-known NGO from Germany. Our CEO likes to say Medico is neither medical nor international organization, which is in a way true. So we work together with local partner organizations all over the world, but we staying here, we don't go to other countries to tell what's the best to do there. So the idea was always people know better. And I would say Medico comes from a classical anti-imperialist roots in the 60s, 70s, was also on the side of multiple anti-colonial struggles in the 80s, but also changed also after the 90s and in the during the globalization movement where Medico participated, also changed a bit his roots, let's say. Anyway, we worked with partner organizations in a political way, mostly in about 30 countries, and our focus lies primarily in the Middle East, so Palestine, Lebanon. Yeah, can you put it louder, or do I have to speak louder? Okay. So our focus lies primarily in the Middle East, but we also work in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and we're also working in emergency relief. So, for example, my last 5 or 4 trips brought me to Chile, where we already talked about, to Gaza, to Ukraine, and to Lebanon. So that's a bit the field we are in. So, now to your question. I'm sorry for that. From our practical experience, which is mainly visiting people, talking to people in different political and social scenarios, but also people who are doing primary healthcare things, who are doing migrant initiatives. I would actually tend to say the opposite, which is a bit included in your question. I would say what we're seeing on the ground is mainly regression. And this regression, in my view, has at least two, let's say, interconnected dimensions: a material financial one, and the outcome of these processes, and the political one. So, two things on that. As medico, we've been critically reflecting on the aid system for decades. So it was kind of our DNA to do that. We did conferences and articles, publications on that. There was always the slogan, the world does not suffer from a lack of aid, it suffers from conditions that continuously make aid necessary. And we are also always reflecting on the, let's say, colonial aspects of aid and also of donor-driven projects and this whole discussion. But at the same time, we have always tried at the same time really defend the right to receive aid in situations where you don't have the right to have rights or any social systems which are serving. So one example, given what we experienced in the last months, I took it, it's an example from South Africa, because I thought it's also interesting for the discussion here, because it's a BRICS state. So what happened after the US aid cuttings in South Africa, which maybe to say that the aid system is in the newspapers every day at the moment. So it's not something the NGOs, the UN is doing something. I mean, it's about UNRWA. It's a place where people in Gaza get shot at the moment. It is a main topic also on the Trump administration. There were not only taxes, there was also a cut on US aid. So the US Development Agency, USAID, is being dismantled, and 10 national tuberculosis programs in Africa are cut. The UN AIDS agency says that at the moment around 600 people a day are already dying due to the lack of access to antiretroviral medication, and so on. So this is what happened in as a direct outcome of the cuttings of the US aid. And there is also another program of which is connected to US aid in a certain way, the PEPFAR program. It is, maybe I think the biggest program which was set up in history from the United States, and was to defeat HIV and AIDS all over the world. So in South Africa, over the years, South Africa has built the largest HIV program in the world. PEPFAR, so the American program, played a huge role in making that possible. Since its launch in 2003, it has been the largest single financial commitment by any country, like I said. Thanks in large part to PEPFAR, 5.8 million people in South Africa have been able to access HIV treatment, and roughly 50,000 people die every year still. So now that PEPFAR funds are being pulled, entire programs are collapsing. 15,000 healthcare workers suddenly lost their jobs. People who have dedicated years of their lives and their skills to these programs. Renewed research institutes are collapsing or are near to collapse. Testing and treatment infrastructure is broken. Community-based prevention efforts are collapsing, also because of the lack of the experience of the 15,000 healthcare workers who were fired, let's say. So we work in South Africa with a community health worker group. They were also quite active during the Corona crisis. So we were more or less in daily contact with them. And what they say us is that it's a total disaster and catastrophe, and also that the collapse which is already produced is irreversible. So, and this is just one of the many, many and nearly only experiences we make through through our partner organizations and their voices at the moment. So this on the material and financial thing. And very briefly, I think the political dimension, which is interconnected to these processes. I would say, and quote Sandro Mezzadra and Michael Hart, who wrote an article which was also translated at Medico. Sandro is also here on this conference. They said that the soft power mechanisms are pulled away in a way in the last years, and this is also the process which is going on in the US and in the Trump administration. And of course, and this is my last sentences, of course one could argue that this just exposes the reality behind the rhetoric of the West. So the West is, let's say, showing its true face, showing what it really is and what it always was. But from the perspective of an aid organization, it's not that simple. The ideological framework may have been full of contradictions, but still had concrete material consequences. And at the moment, the material consequences of showing the real face, they are heavy. So it's not just showing something where we can see the truth. It's in fact a process of regression also in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mario, for your point of view from your practical work at Medico. I think that was very interesting for all of us. And now we are getting in a second round of questions, and I will again start with you, Vijay, but I have learned from the first round I have to tighten it a bit to get a more concrete answer, maybe. I will try it. And my question has to do with the word that Mario already spoke about, BRICS. So you have long argued that alliances among the global south are vital to challenge imperialism, racism, capitalism, and so on. Would you say that BRICS or ASEAN and similar alliances can empower the global south, or are they replicating old patterns of power under new flags?
It might actually be interesting to reflect for a minute on Mario's example directly, which is healthcare in South Africa. You know, it's interesting if you think about it, that South Africa, which is a country with so much wealth, diamonds, previously gold and so on, that a country like that has to rely on the crumbs from the United States, you know, USAID money. Why wasn't South Africa, now 30 years after apartheid, able to build its own public health infrastructure? Yeah, it's a fair question. Why not? What's the problem? Well, turns out that during the transfer of power, there was a negotiated settlement with the old apartheid elite, including firms like the Oppenheimers, who owned some of the largest mines in South Africa, and who built a foundation called the Brenthurst Foundation, which regularly churns out material on the importance of not touching old property relations. I mean, in fact, the Brenthurst Foundation leader, Greg Mills, has an office right next to the president of Zambia's office. They have deep roots influencing people across Africa. But as some of you who've worked in South Africa will know, Brenthurst has very deep roots in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, and influences through all kinds of things which we don't call corruption. It's very interesting. We don't call it when private entities set up foundations and then influence government. We don't call that corruption. We call that lobbying, and that's okay. Brenthurst has made a really big push in South Africa not to allow higher taxation for instance, and better royalty rates for the government from mining. And so Oppenheimer continues to make a lot of money off diamond mining, and so do a range of other companies, many of them based in Stellenbosch in the near Cape Town. So the state simply is unable to raise the kind of money that it should and unable to build the kind of apparatus that is necessary for public health, and has not been able to over the last 30 years, and also has not committed itself to. That's another problem. There are class relations in places like India and South Africa that are adverse to building the dignity of their own people. So then they continue to rely on things like aid from the United States. I mean, we shouldn't be relying on USAID. I don't even agree with the term soft power. We don't want any power to influence our countries. We want to be self-reliant. India doesn't really need foreign entities to come in and provide health care. The Indian government should be able to provide health care to its population. I mean, if Cuba, and I visited Cuba, I don't know, almost every year for the last God knows how many years, if Cuba can produce health care for its own people under a blockade, and then can export doctors to help other people do their health care, certainly India should be able to do it, for God's sake. If you have a nuclear bomb, you should be able to provide immunization without relying on, the United States to send people with immunization. India is one of the great producers of vaccines. We don't need to import assistance, That's the real tragedy. The real tragedy isn't the stopping of the aid. The real tragedy is that our commitment to self-reliance on education, healthcare, and so on, our addiction to non-profit organizations taking over these sectors is, I think, the problem. We have to get past this addiction. We have to start really thinking seriously about the fact we can do this ourselves. You go to China, the Chinese don't import healthcare. They don't import, literacy campaigns. They do it themselves because they have been able to actually properly harness their resources. I think that's important. The first question is, are you harnessing your resources? In Burkina Faso, for instance, rural electrification is only 7%. But Burkina Faso has enormous reserves of gold under the ground, which have previously been stolen for nothing. Now Ibrahim Traoré is saying we've got to harness our own gold. We've got to be able to get resources. We've got to train our own people. And he frequently paraphrases the saying from Captain Thomas Sankara, who was the president of Burkina Faso from 1983 till he was assassinated in 1987. Sankara used to regularly say one variant of this phrase: he who feeds you controls you. Learn to feed yourself. Food sovereignty is important. It's not just about food. It's about medical care. It's about education. It's about everything. We have to learn to take care of ourselves. And where we can't, we have to build internationalism that is not about reliance. It's that old line from the Bible, right? The great book called the Bible. If you give somebody a fish, they eat for a day. I got this line actually from a pop song. If you give somebody a fish, it's from Arrested Development. If you give somebody a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach them how to fish, they eat forever, right? It's a pretty good slogan. People need to be taught to fish. They don't need to have somebody come in and vaccinate them, yeah? I think this is a pretty straightforward point. You're going to build a new world order. You've got to empower people. So then, Vincent, right to your question, and this is the point, there's a temptation for us when we think about BRICS and so on. There's a temptation for us to think only of the term sovereignty. And in my opinion, sovereignty is the first category. It's a primary category, it's the first category, but it's not the only category. It opens the door to something new. Countries want to exercise their sovereignty. Sovereignty is insufficient. The other category has to be yoked to it, and we have to fight in the battle of ideas and the class struggle to ensure the second category is up there on the mantelpiece right next to sovereignty. And that category is dignity. We're not just fighting for sovereignty. We're fighting for sovereignty and dignity. Because I tell you, again, whatever you call it, socialism, whatever word you use, if you fight for sovereignty and you fight for dignity, theoretically, you're going to build a socialist society. Because what you're fighting for is the necessity of a territory lived in by people, not to have somebody else's will imposed on them. That's sovereignty. But you're also fighting for a world where the people who live in that territory, all of them, live with dignity. And dignity is very much about not learning to do everything yourself. Yeah, you know, those of you who have children know that statement where a child says, I can do it by myself. Yeah, I can put my socks on by myself, put my pants on, whatever. But let me tell you something, we don't want to do everything by ourselves. I actually do want to go to a medical doctor. Yeah, I don't need to treat myself, although I do it quite often on the internet. And, you know, find a way to get the medication and whatnot, but it's a very bad idea. Don't recommend it. I'm not recommending it. But as a society, we don't want somebody else to come in. Yeah, we want to learn as much as possible to live with sovereignty, but also dignity. Everybody with dignity. I was walking back to the hotel earlier, and I saw a man who lives on the street, I think, struggling with his pants. Yeah? His dignity is compromised. But it's not just his dignity compromised. It's everybody who walks past him and does nothing, including myself. I felt ill, you know, walking past him, thinking, what can I do? Can I give him some money? But that's hard. That's like the worst kind of charity. How do I allow this man to live a dignified life? Yeah, so that's why whatever world we build, Vincent, the concept sovereignty is insufficient. It has to be yoked to the concept of dignity, and that to universal dignity. Not dignity for 5 people, but dignity for all of us, including that man on the road on the way to the, you know, Moxie Hotel.
Thank you, Vijay. Now I have 2 more words that I have to think about for the whole night, I guess, or for the whole week. That was very interesting, the connection between the 2 terms. Radhika, one more question for you. Should the European left align itself with BRICS and other alternative blocs, or should it build entirely new alliances and visions of internationalism? What could these alliances look like?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very interesting question. So, you know, this requires us to go back to a point that I kind of started making, and maybe I will now finish making, which is that, you know, there was when the term BRICS began to be used widely, it looked as though China was just, you know, one among several countries that were growing strongly and so on. But in the 15 years since, we've seen a very different reality. And I think that this reality bears some thinking about. Basically, in India, we have the Modi government. In South Africa, well, the government has changed, but anyway, the Ramaphosa government before that, anyway, there's not huge change, but the point I'm trying to, and in Brazil, you had at least for a brief time Bolsonaro, and even today, the Lula government is challenged by the forces that supported Bolsonaro. Who are these forces? In all of these 3 countries in particular, of the 5 main BRICS, you have governments that are essentially subservient to the power of big corporations in those countries. And more generally around the world, in most countries in the world, the big corporations are calling the shots. They essentially demand that the government do this, that, or the other. They are the... sorry, that's... Yeah. Oh, that's better. These big corporations are the agencies that are responsible for creating the realities to which Mario was referring and Vijay was referring. That is to say, you know, why is it that despite South Africa being so rich, I mean, Brazil and South Africa in terms of resources are absolutely swimming in it. They are exceedingly rich. But nevertheless, they have high degrees of poverty, inequality, etc. And the reason for that is corporate power. And in India as well, basically what we've seen is that what little progress that was made in the first 3 or 4 decades after independence has melted away. For a brief time between 2004 and 2014, we had a slightly progressive government that seemed to make a difference, but that is now gone again. And we have a government that thinks essentially, you know, if you ask me, I feel that the Modi government has a one-point economic program. It is to do whatever not only the big corporates, but a handful of the biggest corporations in the country want Modi to do. All they have to say to Modi is jump, and he will say how high. So he is willing to do everything that these people want them to. And this is what is creating the misery, inequality, deterioration of social services, slow growth, everything, because a lot of the investment of these companies actually is not productive investment. So, so in that sense, then, and to go back to the point on which Vijay was also talking, what exactly does it mean to have sovereignty? Sovereignty is not just that you have a flag, a postage stamp, an airline, etc. That does not constitute sovereignty. Effective sovereignty means that the government should be able to discipline the capitalist class. And this is actually not the case not only in countries like India or Brazil or South Africa, it is not even the case in Germany or the UK, or for that matter, the United States. So, and I think that this, and that's why, you know, essentially you have this kind of, well, economic misery. Anyway, so to come back to your question, to ally with the BRICS as such is perhaps today a more difficult question. But nevertheless, I think that but at the same, okay, so let me add one other point. Having said that, even a government like Modi's, much as he would love to rush into the arms of the United States, he is constrained from doing that because today, the ability of the United States' economic gravity has massively diminished, whereas that of China has increased, and to a lesser extent Russia. I don't put China and Russia in the same camp, but circumstances over the last decade or so have also forced Russia to take a number of more progressive economic policies than it would have done otherwise, because it's running a war economy and so on. So it has also been asserting its economic sovereignty much more than it was doing before 2014. So, to come back to this, because of these circumstances, because capitalism is really no longer a solution, even at a minimal level, countries like India, South Africa, Brazil are not going along with the West. So I think if the European left can understand these circumstances and then act on the basis of that, support at least the progressive stances these countries are able to take, I think that would be the way to go. Underlying all this, I think that it's important to remember that, you know, I always used to be a little puzzled by the idea of internationalism on the Western left, because it seemed to assume that somehow the entire world is going to become socialist in one loud thunderclap. That's not how it's going to happen. It's going to happen by different governments. You know, you often speak of a multi-speed Europe, right? So you're going to have a multi-speed revolutionary process in which some countries will go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Other countries may even regress. But at any given time, what I'm simply saying is that not allying with the BRICS, by not endorsing the idea that you should simply align with the BRICS, I am not saying that you should not identify progressive regimes in general and regimes that are doing the right thing at any given time and support them, make issue-by-issue alliances with them. And I think that that is a way you have to go. And I think all I'm saying is that you also have to take seriously the fact that nations will also be critical actors in the building of socialism, not just classes. So that's what I'm, that's what I spoke about earlier in my speech this morning, and that's what I'm urging on you today. So should the European left align with the BRICS or other alternative blocs? Yes, if they're pursuing pursuing policies that lead to greater multipolarity, by which I mean greater spread of productive power around the world, greater assertion of economic sovereignty around the world, and of course the pursuit of progressive policies, etc., and a diminution of the imperialist insistence on imposing neoliberal policies on all countries of the world. An insistence that countries should have the right to take their own initiatives. And one final point, a lot of the discourse of the West in general is confused by the raising of the notion of minority rights, gender rights, etc. You know, but the fact is that the United States did not go to war in Afghanistan to save Afghan women. It has done more harm to Afghan women in the course of its long war in Afghanistan and many other such countries. So, you know, it's not just a question of whether women can, you know, how they are able to dress or not. It has to be a whole cornucopia of policies. What is women's access to health, to education, you know, the right to have, limit the number of children they have, etc. Many people think that Iran must be a nightmare for women, but Iran shows some of the best statistics as far as women's health, education, fertility, etc. is concerned. Women's fertility rates in Iran match those of any Scandinavian country that I know of. So these are things that we have to take into consideration. It's not just about electing a woman to be president. You know, it's also about what is the condition of the vast majority of women in that country. Those things also have to be taken into account. So that is my slightly long-winded answer to your question.
Down to one mic.
Only one mic, but it's a loud one, so perfect. Yeah, thank you again, Radhika, for your very enlightening, do you say so? Yeah, enlightening point of view. I have the feeling that I already learned quite a bit tonight. Mario, for you, I have a question concerning a topic that we didn't spoke much about it yet, but which is already present on the stage here, as you can see. It is about Palestine and about Gaza. And I think nowadays there can't be a panel without focusing on this too. We are currently witnessing people all over the world expressing their solidarity with the people of Gaza. How do political reactions and expectations from Germany complicate the work of international solidarity structures? And what does this say about the conditions for transnational social movements in a supposedly multipolar world?
Our loud micro is back. Okay, this is a very big question, and it makes it even more difficult for me because the other questions which are on stage are also very, very big, and I want to say something on them too. So I anyway try. On the first question, Gaza and Palestine, I try to make it a bit shorter, not because of the topic is not so important, but our experience as medico is very clear. But I'm talking now about the German situation. I mean, it was kind of a tipping point. We are not anymore in the heart of the beast, or we are not getting addressed as we are in the heart of the beast center of something. We are just provincialized by the political discourse and the political actions of the German, but also the European politicians in the last months. So people just say, I don't know what are you doing in Germany, but we are not interested anymore. So I think this, for me, this was very, very important because it also helped to reflect a bit, let's say, on the imperialist aspects of anti-imperialism, in minimum in the let's say in the first world zones, so that you put yourself always as the anti in the center. So you are the center, and I mean this was in our small political and social world definitely super important to understand this provincializing process. But that's not an answer on the question what happens in Gaza, but what happened here. But maybe to connect the Palestinian question a bit to what we had on the stage, I mean, I just can try. I think we had a conversation about sovereignty, or I would say about aid and sovereignty. We have a lot of pictures from Gaza about this question, let's say, aid and no sovereignty, but also the question who is delivering aid at the moment, the US and Israel, into a war zone where they drop the bombs at the same time, things like that. So it's a complicated, very, very complicated sphere. And you are absolutely right. If you look at Gaza, you see that you can not only use aid to make people or nations dependent, you can also use aid to make a war against them. So you can also use aid as a weapon in war and so on. No question, no doubt on what you said. And of course, we can see in Gaza also, it is used for that. It is used as a weapon, it is used as a production of images, and it's used as a political, as a negotiation tool, let's say. But at the same time, I am not convinced on one or 2 points you said. I'm not a doctor, I have to say that again, you asked me, but through the work on a also medical and health organization, during the times of Corona, I can say one thing. There are different health problems where there are no national answers. And I add something which has not only to do with my health career. I mean, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifest, they told us we have a world to win, not a nation. And I think this should be also the starting point of our questions. So I would say when you ask me, should the US deliver worldwide to defeat HIV, AIDS, chronic diseases, Corona, whatever, I would say, of course they should. Of course they have to pay. Of course Europeans have to pay for that. But we need political mechanisms which do not lead these processes of payment to new dependencies. So, of course, we are, I think, in that question, we are on the same page. But I think sovereignty is not an answer to different type of questions, and history also shows us that sovereignty often was a path into the next nightmare instead of solving the problems we are discussing here. So we can maybe continue this discussion, but I'll leave it at that.
May I add a couple of things? I just wanted to say, I mean, again, with great admiration for you, Mario, and all the work you're doing. I mean, this is really not personal in any way, but you know, Marx does say, of course, as you rightly say, Marx and Engels say we have a world to win, not just a nation. But they also say in the same work in the Communist Manifesto that every working class must settle its affairs with its own bourgeoisie first. So there is definitely a conception of nation in that document. You know, most people read that document, they read the first few pages which lionizes the bourgeoisie and then skip to the end, and you know, everything in between gets lost. And in that bit in between, they are pointing out that there are countries. These countries compete with one another. The bourgeoisies compete with one another. As I say, every nation has to settle affairs with their own bourgeoisie, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you know what you said, I mean, it's something I've been thinking about, because I have a lot of good friends who are always saying, you know, the US must pay more in aid and so on. And it's not like I object to it. That's not the kind of work I do, so I don't do it. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I've always been a little uneasy about this. And I think that when you were explaining this, I suddenly sort of thought that I'm clearer about it. So basically, think about it this way. NATO, you know, Vijay was talking about Mark Rutte and his subservience to the US and so on. NATO worked as it did, worked in a certain way up till very recently, in which the United States paid most of the money, but the United States also got to call the shots. Now, if the Germans and the French and everybody else starts paying more, they will ask for a greater say. I mean, there's an old English saying, who pays the piper calls the tune. And that's what you're going to see. I think that, you know, and also the other thing is that the aid that is often provided, you know, the United States may provide Europe with security or provide third world country with aid, but bulk of this aid money finds its way back to that country. It does not go to the person who is supposedly the beneficiary. The overwhelming majority of aid money finds its way back to the country concerned. I'm not talking about organizations like yours, but the usual type of aid organizations, typically, you know, Western government aid companies and so on. They're basically paying their own people to do various things. So those were things I wanted to say. I think Mario wants to say something. I'll add this back.
I wanted to add something, not as a direct reply. I think the nation, or also national class struggles, let's say, of course, is a territory. So I would not deny that. I think at the same time, is an important territory. At the same time, I'm not so sure if the bourgeoisie is that national. You cannot locate it like maybe Marx could do it in the 19th century. So you have international bourgeoisie, so you have to fight with them internationally. But what I wanted to say is something different. I think when we talk about national sovereignty as a strategy, so I just want to add that I think if we talk about in these times about national sovereignty, and if we should maybe even link our struggles to certain states of the global south and so on, I want to warn, let's say, that we should keep in mind that national sovereignty is also a framework of people like Trump, of anti-migration politics. It is a framework also used as a more or less progressive social thing. Let's look back at the Brexit, for example, which in many cases in the global north, let's say, lead to reactionary politics, regressive politics. So in times of national sovereignty claimed as a tool of change from the radical right, and in times where we are confronted with a more or less global war regime, which also brings the mentality of war to every living room in the world. So we should be, let's say, very, very careful also as leftists to invent narratives or to reinvent narratives which are also can become a part of the politics of war regimes and the right. So that's important for me.
So I guess you have a fitting Marx or Engels quote as well, and of course you can and you will speak. And afterwards, I want to open this discussion that the four of us are having here to all of you sitting here. So maybe you can already think of interesting questions for the three speakers.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is what Mario just said is a debate that goes back a long time about the concept of nationalism. You know, there are different histories of nationalism. It was interesting when nationalist movements began to prevail in the 1950s in Indonesia, in India, and so on. they were also lectured to about the dangers of nationalism, that nationalism leads to what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And in academic discourse later, nationalism got a bad name, that nationalism in general was a bad thing. But in fact, it's not nationalism or sovereignty itself that is abstractly under review or in discussion. It's the class character of nationalism and the class character of sovereignty. So an anti-colonial nationalism, for instance, is very different from the jingoistic nationalisms of 19th century United States that led to the 1898 war. So the Filipino nationalism of 1898 was different from US imperialist nationalism of 1898. They clashed. Those were two quote-unquote nationalisms. But in fact, the character of the two nationalisms was very different. So today, for instance, when, let's say, a country like Sri Lanka with a new center-left government says, well, we want to exert our sovereignty against the International Monetary Fund, what the government of President Dissanayaka is doing cannot be described as anything like what Trump is doing in the United States. These are very different forms of claims of sovereignty. Yeah? So, I would get uncomfortable if one said to President Dissanayaka, you have to be careful about using the language of sovereignty because, Trump is also using the language of sovereignty. But Trump is also using the language of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so do other countries. The word itself is not as important as what the word, in fact, is rooted in. The process it's rooted in, the class character of the demands. The fact that I think when a country, again, like Senegal right now, again with the center-left government is trying to exert its sovereignty, or the Sahel states trying to exert their sovereignty, that's the word they use. When they say French out, they are using the word sovereignty. And if Marine Le Pen also uses the word sovereignty, they are not using the same concept. They are just using the same word. The alliance of Sahel states, after all, are 3 Sahel states that have joined together using the term sovereignty. Sovereignty is used in many places as a regional concept, not necessarily national. And besides, in many countries in the South, these are not ethnic nationalist countries. These are multinational states. Interestingly, in South Africa, returning to that example, the xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment that has manifested itself is really ugly, but it's not used by the people who are talking about sovereignty. It's used by the people who are talking about ethnic nationalism, particularly like, the Zulu nationalists and so on. These are not the people talking about sovereignty. They're talking about ethnic nationalism. So, I would be uncomfortable if somebody told me, you have to be careful of this because of that. I would say, well, why should I be careful? I'm well aware. It's not that we don't live in the same world and know what Trump is like or Orban is like. I don't need to be lectured about that. I know that. But I also know that Burkina Faso and their claim to the word sovereignty is completely different from anything coming in the global north. And I don't think we should look for either analogies or, warnings about that because it's a completely different history.
Thank you, Vijay, and thanks to all the 3 of you for answering my questions. And now I want you to answer some questions. I already see one hand up, and there are several more. The first one I saw was around there. Yeah. Somebody just has to start.
I am indeed from Haiti. I'm also from Germany, though. So I think that specifically what I found interesting on the panel is that there's an obvious tension between who are we speaking, who are we addressing right now. And I think that there's an important part of differentiating the words that we use because of the history of the West to always oversimplify the nuance and the political nuance of Global South governments, etc., to always find the analogy that fits the Western experience. And I appreciate that there was a resistance to that, but I would also like to go beyond that and also allowing for more nuance in qualifying what is it actually that we're trying to go towards when we talk about socialism. When we, for example, talk about China, is China really still socialist, communist in the way that we have learned it to be? When does a country start being too capitalist to be communist anymore? And also, a second question when it comes to sovereignty, and I think that's another tension that was clear on the panel, are we thinking from the top, from nation-state structures, or are we thinking from below, from people's struggles? And I think there's an inherent contradiction and I guess a prioritization we have to make when we start thinking about what we're walking towards or what we are working towards. In what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize a strong national class movement in India, for example, at the expense of Kashmiri sovereignty, of Kashmir food sovereignty also? And then we talk about the many different people's movements. We talk about Cuba also. Cuba has been in a blackout for multiple weeks this year already, and Cuban doctors are in Haiti to try to make money to send back to their families. So there is, of course, this beacon of, symbolism that goes with socialist struggles, but also I would like to kind of draw out what you think the nuance is in terms of what are we aiming for. And I think that there's many African Marxist thinkers who were very close to answering that idea who have all been assassinated. So I think that I would also like to bring this Marxist thought maybe into the room.
I have no clue who was next, to be honest, but I guess you have maybe.
Should be now. Okay, hi, my name is Hiroen Villamar and I'm from Mexico. So my question is not to all members of the panel, but to the chair of the panel. So as a member of the Congress, my question is now, so what is the Fracción doing as a political work with other congresses around the world to try to also bring this message? Yes, we want to think of not a new order, but a new world. So what is your contribution in that case? And let me tell you only just this. Early this week, no, last week, sorry, there was a delegation of 3 AFD members of the Congress visiting Mexico. So this is the first delegation of members of the new legislature period of the Bundestag, and I'm, of course, absolutely horrified. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you a lot for your input, and I want to thank you too for your very interesting question. That my question, I think, follow-ups a bit too, because I'm doing my PhD in corporate law, and I thought it was a very interesting point that you made about sovereignty and the point that the state had to control their capitalistic class. And I was thinking, what is your point of view on reformistic ways like supply chain law that now is implemented from European countries on also third world countries, like implementing UN standards that are developed by northern countries in their values of human rights, and who is in the end the group that has to really fight the capitalistic class, because the capitalistic class in a lot of countries are the corporations also, like, are the corporations that are also German companies, for example. Like, who is it in the, who, like, German, like a German company, for example, having like subsidiaries in a lot of countries, but who in the end has really to fight them? Who is it? Like, is it the class or is it the government that has to implement the law? Which way do we should go?
Thank you. Thank you for the inspiring words. I have one comment and one question. I have to say that respectfully, I disagree with this bond that it must be created between the left countries and BRICS. Not only because recently more than 20% of the participation has taken out of South Africa and Venezuela and taken by Russia and China, but more than that, because the new development bank of BRICS are copying the structures of the World Bank and the IMF. So clearly, we have to think it's how to restructure BRICS before it takes the form of what the Security Council, P5, such disaster institutions. So that's what I wanted to say regarding that. And second, talking about superpowers, I would like to ask you if any idea coming to your heads to stop the countries to signing the structural adjustment plans forced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that keeps underdeveloping, like taking the opportunity of developing, especially in the new and small countries in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, now it's on. Really good questions. I'm actually going to come at the questions by thinking about the phrase, how we phrase things. Who should we ally with? Or who should we primarily support, and so on. Interesting thing about the philosophy of history of Marxism, for instance, is that history happens, it's happening out there. And you intervene depending on your capacity and strength. Like, I'm not capable of telling the European left what to do. The European left is doing what it's doing. BRICS states are doing what they're doing. BRICS, the movements inside these countries are doing what they're doing. My capacity is limited. I run a research institute. We work with 400 political movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America. We engage with them, we learn what they are doing, we accompany them, we produce materials about things like structural adjustment, about things like NATO and so on. So I'm always a little worried when questions come, should we work with the state or should we work with the movement? Because in a sense, we take all kinds of opportunities. If a movement suggests to us, you need to, like I was in Colombia last week, let's go and meet the energy minister. We took the meeting, and met the energy minister and had a long and very good discussion about what they are doing in the transfer from fossil to other fuels, other forms of energy. One doesn't actually get the opportunity to make a choice. We are not that powerful. We are in a very weak situation. The international left is extraordinarily weak. We have to take opportunities where they come to us. We are not in a position right now where the balance of forces allows us actually to make the opportunities. I'm not feeling great saying that, by the way. I would like to have the left be more powerful so that we could actually make the opportunities. We have to take opportunities. So even, sorry to answer the question for you, but Even, the left party in Germany also has to, in a sense, look for what opportunities present themselves. Maybe take initiative and go to Mexico. It's a beautiful country, yeah. Take a delegation and so on. But really, we also need to think very much along the line of what we can do and how we're doing things already, the kind of Kantian approach of this is what we should do and so on doesn't often help us, because it also demobilizes us. There are certain things that the balance of forces don't permit us to do. And so we need to be very cautious with each other. What can we do? What should we, what can we do? What are we able to do? What opportunities present themselves? The question of China has always interested me. When the Chinese Revolution happened, it's interesting that they didn't call it the Socialist Republic of China. They didn't go even further and say Communist Republic of China. They called it the People's Republic. And even today, when you talk to people in China, they don't say that, we have arrived at socialism. They say maybe in 2049, socialism can begin, the stage can begin. It's always interested me that scholars in the West write books with titles like Is China Socialist or Has China Reversed into Capitalism? I mean, they are building a people's economy. That's what they are doing. They are trying their best to advance, to transcend the problems of people's everyday lives. They don't make claims that need to be knocked over, because, for God's sake, they are not saying they are doing this. But there is one interesting feature that I would like to put before you. A couple of months ago, I had lunch with some people who are, I guess you would call them entrepreneurs or venture capitalists in Shanghai. And I was asking them, a situation for you poor capitalists in China. And, they were quite funny, and they said something that is actually pretty interesting and insightful. They said, there are capitalists in China, of course, but there's no capitalist class. We are not allowed to form a class. We don't own media. We don't own television stations or newspapers. We don't control the banks. The banks are all basically in the state hands. We can't form an association of capitalists. We can't lobby the government. The institutions of a capitalist class just don't exist. So, when people outside say, well, it's capitalist, what you're referring to is it's industrialized. You're referring to the fact that there are people who operate in a constructive market. That there are market forces at play. By the way, market forces themselves are not by themselves capitalist. There were market forces at play 1,000 years ago. But of course, we don't think of those as capitalist. Credit markets, all kinds of things are highly constrained within China. In fact, even in businesses, there is a Communist Party secretary, in the business, who is there at the table at board meetings and so on. So I found this quite interesting, that, it is a different setup. And this obsession about whether China is capitalist or not strikes me as missing the point. Let's first try to understand how China operates, rather than, how do we label it? Yeah, that's an obsession that I don't have. I'm fascinated with Asia, my own continent, because my continent has its own crazy history. We have experienced colonialism and then imperialism in such bizarre ways, such different ways. And we really are still catching up with our assessment of what happened. It's like somebody came and slapped me, and then an hour later, I'm like, what happened? We still don't fully understand the colonial experience and what it did to us. Utsa Patnaik's calculations about the drain of wealth came out like 8 years ago. Long after colonialism ended. Long after colonialism, we're still figuring out how our histories are intertwined with Scotland. Where Glasgow was built basically on the backs of the city where I was born, the city of Calcutta, the jute industry. Dundee was built by the jute industry. We're coming to terms with it now. And people, when I come to Europe, people sometimes say, you're still so obsessed with colonialism. I'm not obsessed with colonialism. Colonialism is obsessed with us. It remains stuck with us. Yeah? We're still coming to terms with it. It's going to take very long time to get through this. And some of these ugly, distorted histories that we have to go through are a consequence of, in a way, the complexity of coming out of colonialism. You know, China, Vietnam, we moved revolutions in countries that really shouldn't have had revolutions. You should have had the revolution. I mean, Radhika accused me of haranguing people earlier. I'm going to really harangue you. Where was your revolution of 1919? You should have had the revolution. Rosa-Luxemburg should not have been killed. Karl Liebknecht should not have been killed. You should have made the revolution and advanced the Soviet revolution in a different direction. But you didn't. And so the Soviet revolution had to go eastward. And the Chinese and the Vietnamese and then the Cubans, all extraordinarily poor countries, had revolutions and then had to advance the productive forces and socialist dignity at the same time. There was no textbook for that. Europe sat back and watched it and judged it. But we have to understand that these places were doing things that maybe were even against the rules of historical materialism. And that's itself something to both commend and be patient with.
I think that's a harangue that I can fully, wholeheartedly support. So, no, I mean, seriously, I think that the extent to which Western countries, European countries, were recouped for capitalism after the revolutionary wave of the post-First World War revolutionary wave is, I think, very important and interesting. And I think that the rise of fascism is intimately connected with it. So, you know, yeah. So that's just something so yeah, thank you, Vijay, that was very good. So, okay, in my own way, I just want to add a few things. I think Vijay's point about the Chinese capitalists in China not being allowed to be creator class is actually quite an interesting point. And I've not made that, but I would, it's very compatible with the way in which I always deal with the question of, is China communist? Yes, there's a lot of private enterprise in China. Yes, there are lots of capitalists in China. Yes, some of them are exceedingly rich, exceedingly big, and exceedingly powerful. Yes, many of them are even members of the Communist Party and hobnob with the upper echelons of the Communist Party. But in China, the party state controls the capitalist class. In the West, it is the other way around. And that is the biggest difference. That's why I was going on earlier about the state needing to control corporate capital. Because you see, in a lot of our Proudhonist fantasies, we imagine that we are going to build a socialism of small, you know, firms and cooperatives and whatever. No, it is in the nature of the way in which we have developed our capacity to produce that we rely on the massification of the productive forces. They are in huge concentrated forms. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. What's wrong with them today is that these concentrated forms of capital are owned privately. They simply shouldn't be owned privately. They're monopolies. Why should monopolies be owned privately? Owning monopolies simply gives you the right to collect rent without doing anything very much. And you see, it was the innocence of Marx that he felt that we would be able to see it. And essentially, that's why he said that once capitalism enters the monopoly phase, it will be ripe for capitalism. But we have been living with monopoly capitalism in the first world countries for more than 100 years. So this is the huge issue. Okay, so what I'm saying is that actually, and you see, the other thing is people forget the intimate connection between the socialization of the productive forces and socialism. Marx felt that the advance of the productive forces, which would be by the socialization of the productive forces, the socialization of labor, this would naturally lead to socialism. But somehow we have essentially been stopped from achieving that. So that's the first point I want to make. And China is more able to deal with massified productive forces because it has it under some type of public control, political control. Control in, if not directly democratic control, at least control that is exercised with a view to advancing the country as a whole, which is a whole sight better than no control being exercised, or control often being exercised with a view to repressing labor and advancing the interests of the big corporations, which is what we see in many Western countries. And the power of big corporations should not be underestimated. Today, they are, as I say, not only are they monopolies that have emerged out of the process of competition, increasingly they are natural monopolies. Why should electricity supply be provided by private companies? Why should water supply be provided by private companies? Why should transportation? These are all natural monopolies. They should never be provided by private companies, but that's what we have increasingly. More and more of our social life is being taken over by companies that are essentially, and you know, the other thing is that these companies make profits not just by exploiting labor, which they do, right, royally, but on top of that, they show that they are increasing productivity by making the customer do half the work. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but very often I joke that, people talk about the service industry. It's not the service industry, it's the self-service industry. You have to do all the darn work yourself. So this is the sort of kind of nightmarish situation we're living in. Okay, sovereignty from top or below. Obviously, I'm going to say sovereignty from below. That is to say, sovereignty should be exercised for the people, not for a capitalist class or other type of elite, etc. I completely take the point that the young woman from Haiti made. Sorry, I didn't see you, and I don't think we've met. But on the whole issue of race, communism, etc. And I would first of all like to say that I think you raise a very valid point. I think you raise a point that is that is often brushed aside. So thank you for raising it. The only way, however, I can answer it, and we can discuss this further if you find my answer unsatisfactory, is that, you see, to my mind, ultimately, racial prejudice arises from economic inequality. And if we address economic inequality, while no doubt a certain kind of lingering racism may persist, but it will have no structural power. The person who shouts at me and calls me a Paki on the street is very often a poor person who is often less privileged than I am. But it is the person who is able to control my life chances. I will give you this job and you will not get this job. You will get, you will get to go here and not here. You will get, this preferment or not that preferment. You will be demoted, blah, blah, etc. This is a structural power of racism that has to be contested. Once you remove that structural power by creating very substantial equality, the rest is much easier to deal with, I would say. I mean, I can imagine that certain prejudices will persist, but they will, they will not, they will have no staying power. So that's my response to that. The question about state control of the capitalist class and reforms like supply chain reform, etc. There is a very fashionable leftism which says that, we are going to drink fair trade coffee and buy fair trade cotton, and we are going to trace every last element of whatever product we buy so that it does not have, exploitable. All labor is exploited, but, all labor under capitalism is exploited, but whatever, super exploited labor. But I think that, I think this is essentially this kind of thing only legitimizes a certain niche of capitalism, which says, okay, there will be one capitalist corporation that will supply garments to the ordinary people. And another capitalist corporation, often the same corporation in a different brand or under a different brand or format, will say, we will supply you ethical clothing if you're willing to pay a couple of bucks more. So, you know, and this is the price you will pay for your conscience. But why do we ease our conscience in that way? Why don't we ease our conscience by fighting for socialism? That would be a much shorter, it's a shortcut to, you know, why take the detour? Take the shortcut. And also, why empower the very agencies that you ought to be controlling? So really, we ought to be demanding either the very tight regulation of monopolies or their public ownership, nationalization. And you know, there's another thing here. I don't know how many of you have been following the Thames water situation in Britain. You know, there's a company that was, you know, the water supply in the London area, southeastern England, was privatized decades ago. This company bought Thames Water for bargain basement prices, made absolutely no investment such that the infrastructure is now creaking, used all the profits plus additional debt that they inflicted Thames Water with to pay themselves big dividends and buy back shares so that the share prices would go up. And now the company owes billions of dollars. It's essentially, if it is nationalized, the state will pay compensation to all these people who have already benefited for decades from the privatization of this natural monopoly, which should never have been privatized. I think there should be a campaign for nationalization with minimum compensation only for the proverbial widow who relies on her Thames Water dividends for her pension or whatever. That is to say, only for those who need it, not above a certain amount for, you know, you calculate how much people have made and not compensate them for, you know, anyway, very little. They should not get anything. We can calculate all that. All we need is a couple of good forensic accountants on our side, and we've got it done. Okay, so I think if you're doing a degree in corporate law, I think that's the way that should be used. That's really great. I think corporate law, by the way, is a very interesting field. And by the way, corporations don't have to be private. They can be public. Corporations can be publicly owned, they can be worker-owned. Corporations are necessary simply because of the massification of the forces of production. Nothing wrong with them, provided that you are running them in the proper way. Okay, I agree with the person who said that too many of the BRICS institutions, like the BRICS Development Bank, etc., are copying the IMF and so on. And that's why I gave a very qualified answer to the question, how should the European left relate to the BRICS? So I won't elaborate on that. And yeah, how do you stop countries from signing structural adjustment programs? Boy, this is a big deal. I don't think this can be prevented unless and until in that country there is a political force that says we will suffer a very difficult transition to a better economy rather than turn to the IMF. Because it will be difficult. It will be difficult for ordinary people without that kind of access to capital, etc. But especially considering that bulk of the capital, bulk of the credit supplied by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank typically go into the pockets of the very rich anyway. It should not be, like, it's not rocket science to figure out that structural adjustment programs are not only directly adverse to the interests of ordinary people, but that, you know, that in fact, even in their design, they are not intended to benefit ordinary people. So it should be possible, but the thing is, you have to create the consent for accepting the difficulty that will be experienced in the immediate future for later gains. That is the key. Sorry.
Thank you very much for answering these very interesting questions. Yeah, I'm very sad to have to announce that I can't take any more questions from you, but in the end we will do something fun. Are you ready for some fun? Okay. Because you no, there is no choice. So we all realized that you are able to answer in a very long and maybe a bit difficult way. And now you have just 1 minute each for a final statement on the question, what does your ideal of a just multipolar world look like? I will search for my timer, and you can think of short answers.
Okay, I'm ready.
You're ready? Let me just...
This is not coming out of my 1 minute, right?
No.
Your delay.
Okay, let's go.
You started? Okay. All right. That looks nice. It's a nice phone. The beginning for me, don't put it there, I know it's there. The beginning for me would be the withdrawal of the United States from the whole world. I would like the 900 US military bases to be withdrawn. I would like all that land to be made into hospitals, schools, playgrounds for children after the United States has detoxified it. I would like the United States to withdraw its navy from all our seas. I would like to also see the beginning of a genuine United Nations which is able to exercise through the treaty obligation its charter, and for the United Nations to bring people to the table when there is conflict without the armed
Okay, so to add to that, that's very good. That's excellent. I agree with all of that. And I will add one other thing, I think that the histories of the societies of the third world have to be better known. We all grew up learning Western. I know more about Western history than I know about Indian history. This is appalling. And not only should I know more about Indian history, not only should I know more about African history and Latin American history and Haitian history and all of that, but you all should know more about the history of all of these countries and their interconnections. There is such a prejudice that says that the West has, had the developed science and so on. People forget that until whenever it was, I think the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, people were still using Roman numerals in making calculations. Like try sending a rocket into space with Roman numerals. If it wasn't for in the numerical system, you wouldn't have. How did it come into being? What kind of civilization created it?
You want to buy some seconds? I mean, keep it simple, I think. For me, a wishful multipolar world would be one where all these poles, states, big companies are not as powerful as today. And in a world where let's say the gray zone, which we maybe can see in some small spaces at the moment, emerges as the real interesting thing of our time and makes a new freedom possible.
Beautiful.
So we have a winner.
Yes, exactly. 40 seconds. He didn't put a price on what the seconds would cost, though.
Well, thank all of you so much for all your wisdom you shared with us, and thank Thanks to all of you listening, very concentrated, and it was a real pleasure also for me to sit here amongst of you three. And yeah, now all I have to say is have a nice evening, enjoy, and see you tomorrow, I guess.